Okay, here we are aboard Seafox. Seafox is a 2002 Malo 39. We are currently in San Diego Bay, getting ready to take off for Mexico, and wanted to do a quick overview of our investigation into high pressure common rail diesel engines. So this is Seafox's power plant. This is a Yanmar 4JH57. You can see on the placard here. This boat originally came with a 4-cylinder Yanmar diesel. I'm not sure what the demise of the old Yanmar was, but it was repowered because of a failure. I think it was getting seawater into the exhaust ports. So keep your siphon brake clean. So what is a high pressure common rail engine? Well, high pressure common rail engine is an electronically controlled injection system that meters fuel quite differently than mechanically injected diesel engine. So as you can see, this whole unit right here is something that mechanically controlled diesels do not have. This is the ECU, engine control module. This computer is constantly monitoring operating conditions of the engine, modifying how the fuel is being injected accordingly. Here's our fuel injector. This fuel injector pressurizes the fuel to about 30,000 psi. That fuel is then pushed to a common rail, or almost a manifold, and that manifold is then plumbed to each one of these injectors. How do we know that this is ECU? Well, if you look at this injector, it's got a little QR code right there, and also an electrical plug-in. These electronically controlled injector units can have as many as 7 to 9 injections per cycle, and the reason behind this new technology allegedly is because of the EPA mandates on burning fuel more cleanly. So by manipulating the injection timing and the amount of fuel injected and when it is injected, this engine creates a lot fewer emissions. So we were in Washington in October, helping with the recording of John Neal's virtual seminar and working with Skagit Valley College's very own Mike Beamer. And one of the slides in John's presentation was talking about engines in sailboats, and the slide said high pressure common rail engines. We not recommended. And the discussion went to, well, that's pretty vague, and why are they not recommended? And that gave us an idea and an opportunity to do a more detailed investigation as to, can we provide any more answers for people that are looking to purchase a boat that might want additional information on high pressure common rail engines, and if they should or shouldn't be avoided and why. I decided to take on the challenge. Julie and I are currently in San Diego, California. We've been doing the refit on Seafox since July. And lucky for me, or unlucky for us, we have a high pressure common rail diesel engine on board. We are planning to cruise this boat far and wide. Recommendation of steer clear of them if possible was sparked some questions in my mind as to, what do I need to know as a cruiser that has a high pressure common rail on board? How can I be most proactive in the maintenance and management of this to get the longest life out of it? And what can I do as a boat owner to this engine, and what can't I do? So we bought Seafox in July of 2022, and Seafox was repowered in 2019. And one of the criteria for finding a boat was that it didn't have an insane amount of hours on it, didn't need a repower anytime soon, because if you are going to repower your boat, you're looking at a minimum of $20,000 and a huge inconvenience, because you can't just plop a new engine in. You have to totally dissect your house if you're living aboard. If you're not living aboard, you're still totally dissecting your boat. And then what systems are attached to your engine? Your fuel system, you're probably going to be redoing that. Your exhaust system, I'm sure you're going to be redoing that too. So the fact that Seafox came with newly repowered, and that the owner had also redone the fuel filtration system, also redid the exhaust all the way out the boat, was a huge benefit and a huge selling point. So we got this boat, really excited, cool. We have a newly repowered boat. Come to find out, Seafox has a high pressure common rail Yanmar 4JH57. So the primary difference between an ECU controlled diesel engine and a mechanically injected diesel engine is that the ECU controlled diesel engine, or the high pressure common rail, has a brain. It's a computer that's telling the injectors how many times and how much to inject per revolution of the engine. This is problematic because there are actuators that control diesel going in and out of the common rail, and any issues with the actuators, any issues with the common rail pressure sensors, any issues with your injectors will tell the computer to go into limp mode. Once your engine goes into limp mode, it will not allow the engine to go above 1,000 RPMs. If you're a cruiser and you're out cruising, especially if you're relying on that engine in inclement weather, or if you're becalmed and you want to get somewhere, once this engine is in limp mode, you can't get it out of limp mode. The only person that can get it out of limp mode is an authorized Yanmar dealer that has a special dongle that they plug into your ECU that will read a diagnostics code. And the only way they can wipe that code is by replacing the part that has failed and by resetting the computer. This is hugely problematic because authorized Yanmar dealers are not found all over the world. They're, as far as Yanmar's authorized dealers network, that they will give you a manual. In Mexico, there's only one on the Atlantic side of Mexico. So you are stuck bringing your boat back to the U.S. or going through the Panama Canal if you're in Mexico with a high-pressure common rail engine that has issues and goes into limp mode. When we came back to San Diego, I wanted to do an investigation by talking to one of these Yanmar mechanics that are familiar with these engines and familiar with problems that they may or may not have in the field. As a cruiser that plans on taking one of these engines far and wide, I had some questions that I wanted to answer for myself and questions that I wanted to answer for other cruisers that might be considering a high-pressure common rail powered boat that might help guide their decision as to whether it would be a deal breaker or not to have one of these electronically controlled engines versus one of the old mechanically controlled engines. So, is it the end of the world if you found your dream boat and it has a high-pressure common rail engine? Well, that certainly depends on your plans as a cruiser and your abilities as a boat owner. When I finally had the opportunity to interview one of these authorized Yanmar dealers, which, by the way, I asked 3 different experienced Yanmar dealers and their technicians to do interviews in front of a camera where they would be compensated, where they would be able to plug their business, and all of them declined an interview. So that lack of transparency in the business is a little bit alarming as an owner, and it's kind of a bummer that that's not more commonly shared information. But it seems like there's some secrets that they're guarding, surrounding these engines that that might be a deterrent for people who like to do their own maintenance work. So this is the operator manual that comes with this Yanmar engine. As you'll notice, there are 5 different models covered by this one operator manual, who's about 150 pages long. So do the math. This is not a very thorough book. And for the most part, when it comes to really heavy diagnostics or maintenance procedures, it says that you must go to an authorized Yanmar dealer to have that service done. Also, a large portion of this are system diagrams. As you can see, these are the electrical diagrams for the ECU and which sensor talks to which sensor and how it's connected. Pretty confident that the the typical boat owner is not going to be tracing down these pathways and trying to diagnose why their manifold pressure sensor isn't talking to their third ground. So I did have an opportunity to talk with a technician who did not agree to go on record with his answers. So I'm just going to kind of paraphrase the dialogue that we had, that as these answers may, help someone who doesn't know a lot about a high pressure common rail engine make the decision whether they should or should not buy a boat that has a high pressure common rail engine. This is not a complete deal breaker if you have a boat that needs a repower. A lot of manufacturers are going toward the ECU controlled engines. Volvo still makes quite a few mechanically controlled diesel engines. Beta makes mechanically controlled diesel engines up to, I believe, 110 horsepower. Yanmar, only the really small models are still mechanically controlled, I believe, up to 25 or 30 horsepower. You can still get Yanmars that are mechanically controlled. So if you are a boat owner looking to do a repower, you do have the option. You might have to go with a different manufacturer than what the original equipment in your boat is. You may have to do some work to your stringers or your engine bed to make that fit. But if having a mechanically controlled engine is important to you, you do still have that option. I asked the technician, as a cruiser, what are the most important spare parts that you could have on board for these electronically controlled diesel engines. And just like the mechanically controlled diesel engines, I was not surprised to hear him say fuel filters and your regular impellers, a spare belt. Sadly, all that he really recommended we keep on board. Biggest demise of these engines is dirty fuel, the same as a mechanically injected diesel engine. Unfortunately for these high pressure common rail motors, the fact that the injectors are pressurizing the fuel to 30,000 psi means that there's really high tolerances in the machining of the metals inside the injector. Virtually any dirt, dust, contaminants in the fuel, water will destroy your injector. So having extremely clean fuel with no water in it is probably the most proactive thing you could do to make these engines run for a long time. I did ask about having a spare starter and alternator on board, which we do have on board Seafox. He said that it is a good idea to have a spare alternator and a spare starter on board, and these, if you do replace a starter and alternator, it's not something that you have to program into the ECU to get it to work once it's changed out. It's a direct replacement, and remove the old one, install the new one, and engine should work as it did before you had an issue with your starter or alternator. As you noticed when I was given a tour of our 4JH57, each of those injectors has a QR code on the top of it. When those injectors are born at the injector factory, they do spray tests with these injectors, and that QR code is programmed into the ECU, and it tells that ECU that for a certain amount of time that injector nozzle is open, it will meter X amount of fuel. So I asked the technician if you could carry spare injectors on board, to which he said was not recommended. When they make these injectors at the factory, they push diesel fuel through them to test them out, like I said, and diesel fuel over time will gel up and it will solidify inside of these injectors. So if you have injectors on board for 5 or 6 years as backups, as spares, there's a good chance when you go to use them, they'll be clogged up and they won't work anyhow. He said that some cruisers still do keep spare injectors on board for their ECU engines, and one strategy is to put them in vacuum seal bags in deep storage to try to keep the fuel as fresh as possible. He still didn't recommend doing it. And according to Yanmar, when you have a new injector, you have to have that QR code programmed into the ECU when you replace an old injector with a new one with a different spray pattern or with a different amount of fuel metered per unit of time that injector is open. He said that is recommended, but your engine will still run if you replace an old injector that's faulty with a new injector and do not reprogram the computer with that injector's information. It is not recommended by the EPA, and it will void your warranty by doing this, but it is an option for cruisers to replace their own injectors on these ECU motors. I asked him if there was any way to override codes, like if your engine for whatever reason goes into limp mode and you are restricted on your RPMs because there's a fault going on somewhere in the engine. Is there a way to go around that fault and make the engine just run and perform as normal until you can get to a port and find an authorized dealer that can go in there and identify the part and pull up that trouble code and have the replacement part on hand to get your engine running again? And he said there is not a way to override code. The only way that you can talk to these engine control units is through a specialized plug that only an authorized Yanmar dealer with a username and password to get into their proprietary software has access to. I asked him about lightning protection. I figure, if you have one of these computer controlled engines, a lightning strike could be debilitating. If your boat gets hit by lightning and it fries that computer, then your engine doesn't work anymore. And that's so this technician told me that he has no experience with that happening. He's never talked to someone who's had their computer fried and that it killed their engine. Okay, so in the operating manual, under maintenance, periodic maintenance, it says that fuel injectors should be cleaned, an electronic engine control unit and its associated sensors should be cleaned every 1,500 hours. And I asked the technician, what does that look like? There's an asterisk there and a note below that says, Yanmar recommends the inspection and maintenance of these items should be performed at an authorized dealer or distributor. What does that look like? And he said that the only time that it is recommended that you do that is if you have unlimited deep pockets and you have nothing better to do with your money. He said that that's something that was mandated to be put in there by the EPA, and that inspection and cleaning of these injection parts are only to keep that engine compliant with EPA regulations. Something to be noted. So it's not all doom and gloom with these high-pressure common rail engines. There are some really cool advantages to having them. First being, they're quiet. They're super quiet. Like we've driven by some people that think that we have an electric engine on the boat. Super quiet, very low vibration, it's very fuel efficient also. The reason that the technology brought computers into managing fuel metering is really for emissions. And these are much cleaner engines. If you're really self-conscious about your carbon footprint and you want to have the cleanest diesel engine possible, the emissions from these high-pressure common rail engines are significantly lower than those of mechanically injected diesels. However, the newer mechanically injected diesels do meet the EPA standard for emissions. So you can get a mechanically injected or a electronically injected diesel and still be environmentally conscious. Okay, folks, so is it a deal breaker? As with things, all things boat, both powerboat and sailboat, it depends. You know, if you're not leaving the U.S. and you have a really substantial maintenance budget, I don't see any problem at all with having a high-pressure common rail diesel engine. If you plan on cruising far and wide to places where there is not an authorized Yanmar dealership within, well, thousands of miles, it might be a consideration if you do have the option when you're repowering, whether you'd like to get a mechanically injected diesel or an electronically injected diesel. It might be smarter to go with the mechanically injected diesel. If you read Nigel Calder's mechanical and electrical manual, he has a really good section in there about putting a sampling port on your fuel tank. Clean diesel fuel is going to be the key to longevity for any diesel engine, among other things, but the most important thing you could do is feed that engine clean fuel. I do recommend that everybody install a sampling port in their diesel tank, because if you are religious about sampling your diesel every time your tank is filled, and you can remove liquid contaminants or particulate contaminants before they're even fed to the engine, before they're fed to their fuel filters and clog those up, I don't foresee there being a really big problem with having an electronically controlled diesel engine. One thing I forgot to mention, the technician that I spoke with said that these ECU units are not meant to withstand salt water. They are not sealed against the marine environment. So he said that the biggest demise that he's seen of these is them being flooded with seawater. So nobody ever plans to get their engine up to the injectors in seawater, but that could be something that kills your engine really fast. Okay, so what I really want you to take from this discussion is, don't be terrified of high-pressure common rail diesel engines. Be realistic with yourself. This electronically controlled engine is not going to be the death sentence of your boat. It's not going to mean that you have more expensive maintenance costs. It means that there's going to be different limitations you have with your boat. And so long as you have a really good handle on your fuel quality, your filtration, make sure that you are always sending clean fuel to your engine, there's not a whole lot of negative aspects to owning a sailboat with a high-pressure common rail diesel engine. Until you have error codes that come up and your engine goes into limp mode. Now, we never know when that's going to happen, and if that's something that absolutely terrifies you, then that should be a sign that you might want to get a mechanically controlled diesel engine. If you are always going to be near a port that has an authorized Yanmar dealer and you value having a clean burning, quiet diesel engine that is very efficient, then I would actually recommend having one of these ECU controlled diesel engines. Either way, whether you get the mechanically controlled or the electronically controlled engine, the best thing you could do for these diesel engines is ensure that they have clean fuel. There you go, folks, and make sure you sail your boat, because the more time you spend with sails up, the less hours you're putting on this thing.